Last time we mentioned the actual election of Pope Pius XII on March 2nd, 1939, the fastest conclave, shortest lived conclave since 1623, so over 300 years, where the Roman Pacelli was elected Pope in a period spanning less than 24 hours on the third ballot, taking the name Pius XII. And in this, remember, he was really following what was, not by any means a law, of course, but which was generally customary, that a new pope would take the name of the pope who had made him a cardinal to begin with. There were some exceptions to that. And the pope was not bound to that, of course, but it was customary. One notable exception to that, for example, was Pope Pius IX, actually. Pope Gregory XVI had made him a cardinal. But he took the name Pius, actually, out of admiration for Pope Pius XIII, who was a softliner. That was before Pius IX became a hardliner, which he definitely became, to the extent that Pope Leo XIII was then later elected in reaction to him. But that's from last year or the year before even, so that's outside of our range here. But it was indeed Pius XI who made Pacelli a cardinal, and now Pius XII takes the name of the Pope who made him a cardinal. He was crowned on March 12th in the Vatican Basilica in the presence of representatives from 35 nations, including the United States. So now we enter into the actual study of the reign of Pius XII, which is vast from many aspects. For one thing, the length of time that it spanned, 1939 to 1958, a very busy 19 years, and some of the 19 of the years of the reign of any pope that affect us the most directly. So a great many things happened in the church, in the world at large, during this reign. So we're going to have to be selective in what we study. We don't have forever. I'm not going to take any longer than till Christmas with this, but it might take that long, potentially. Just the number of things into which we could go could take us that long. There are certain things we definitely must cover, other things that we will not talk about any more than perhaps we have already talked about. For example, the things that the most biographies of Pius XII focus on the most. The war, the Jews, all the rest of that. His relations, dealings with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. We've covered that to the extent to which we need to. We're not entering into that anymore. Remember, the reign of Pius XII lasted 1939 to 1958. The Second World War began the same year that his reign began, it's true, but ended 6 years later. 6 years into a reign that was much longer than 6 years. So, by the time Pius XII had been reigning for 10 years, all of that was over and done with. The effects of it, all of it lasting, of course, as it lasts to this day, but all that was done. And he was still busily reigning as Pope. A great many things still happening, but none of which having to do with that one period of history that seems to fascinate everybody endlessly. So, we do have to cover certain things that happened during the Second World War, of course, and one of those leads us into the section we're calling the evil entourage, because it did in fact exist in this case. And that is the first figure we'll look at who came up during the reign of Pius XII. The first unsavory figure is that of a certain Giuseppe Roncalli. So, fast forwarding a few years from 1939, yes, the Second World War begins September 1st with the invasion by Nazi Germany of Poland, which had stood firm in the face of German demands because of its confidence in British and French promises of assistance in the event of an outbreak of war with Germany. But at the same time, Soviet Russia invades from the east, and they divide Poland between themselves. And this is prior, of course, to Hitler's invasion of Russia. But all of that is outside of our scope here. So we're not going to go into all of that. The war, of course, does take its course, and it was on June 30th, 1944, that General Charles de Gaulle had an audience with Pope Pius XII. So Charles de Gaulle had he had a long military career, but he was one of many French officers who fled France when the Third Reich toppled the Third Republic, the French Third Republic, in 1940. Arguably the best thing that they ever did. Arguably. That was the Third Reich was, as we've seen, no prize, but the Third Republic wasn't either. Was plentifully horrible all on its own. And there is, of course, all the famous footage of Hitler riding through the empty streets of Paris, which he was convinced not to destroy, which is that's one thing that Hitler got right, was don't destroy Paris, don't bomb Paris. He did make the French sign their surrender in 1940 in the same train car that the Germans had signed the armistice in 1918, which he then had brought to Berlin. So it was a never-ending revenge game going on there between France and Germany. But by 1944, things had turned around. Obviously, June 30th was the same month as the Allied landings in Normandy. After that, they made rapid progress, liberating most of France from German control and rapidly advancing towards Paris. They hadn't quite gotten there in June, but they were getting there. And great strides were being made through France at that point. So in June, at the end of June, June 30th, de Gaulle meets with Pius XII and is impressed. He said he judges everything from a point of view that transcends human beings, their enterprises, and their quarrels. So this is just going to show here, this just goes to show that Pius XII, as Pope, was indeed quite majestic. He was in that sense being very aristocratic, as we've seen, coming from a noble family, was someone who was very suited to the part in that way. Certainly that. Also from his high degree of intelligence, his expertise in languages, in legal matters, and so on and so forth. He definitely had many qualifications to be Pope, and did a great many, in fact, very good things for the Church, with all of that at his disposal. Although we'll see, there were rats in the walls already, even as early as the 1940s. In fact, we'll get to it later. One of the other things we'll have to cover during the reign of Pius XII is the fact that the Novus Ordo Missae did not spring up overnight, or even spring up during the course of Vatican II itself. We'll have to look at some of the things written by Bugnini in his work, the Liturgical Reform, or a title very similar to that, but the most telling thing about it is the dates that he gives, 1948 to 1975. Starting in 1948, that's when Bugnini himself starts the mark of the move towards the Novus Ordo. Bugnini himself. And in fact, Paul VI himself, when he promulgated the new Mass, said that all of this began, this is the end of a process that began with the changes to Holy Week during the reign of Pius XII. So there can be absolutely no question that was the start of it. And we'll get into the details of that, and of course affects us every single year at Holy Week. Do we apply Epikeia? Of course, we always answer yes, but that does come up. Something that people like to discuss every year at Holy Week is traditional versus 1955, so we'll have to go into that. But again, 1948, relatively early, within the first half of the reign of Pius XII, everything gets started, and we'll see that. But as we've said before, Pius XII did leave the church when he died in 1958 in a flourishing state of affairs in many ways. There's no doubt of that. Of course, that just makes the question of how did everything fall apart so quickly all the more mystifying. But he did. He was in many ways perfectly suited to be the vicar of Christ on earth, in many ways. Of course, France and the Holy See did not see eye to eye. For the next 5 months, Following that meeting, a battle of sorts raged around who would be the nuncio to France. Around the existing nuncio, the current nuncio, Monsignor Valerio Valeri. De Gaulle had demanded Valeri's removal on the grounds that he had been close to the Vichy regime of Marshal Philippe Pétain. Does anybody know how Pétain first became a French national hero? What was his first claim to fame in that regard? They might know one statement very famously associated with that. It was "Ils ne passeront pas," which had to do with the French defense of the city of Verdun, or Verdun. It's such a famous battle, it's come to have its own English pronunciation, Verdun. The Battle of Verdun during the First World War, a battle that lasted 9 months. The German strategy for that battle was one of the reasons why it lasted so long. But their idea was to grind French morale into dust. And it was Pétain who was put in charge of the defense of the city, which was a highly symbolic thing. In itself, there was very little strategic value to that city. But aside from the fact that French morale was one with it, practically. If that had been taken, the French themselves, that would have been an absolute disaster if the Germans had taken that. But it seems that that probably wasn't the German plan to begin with. But all that aside, this was Pétain's first rise to fame, was as the one who masterminded the defense of Verdun successfully, saying that "Ils ne passeront pas." That featured very prominently on French wartime propaganda. They shall not pass, and they didn't. The Germans did not pass. There are reasons for that, but we won't get into it. That's how he first claimed to fame. He was a national hero. He was a Catholic, not a good Catholic. He was known as a womanizer, but he was a Catholic. And in 1940, when he was already in his 60s during the First World War, but then in 1940, when the Germans toppled the French Third Republic, everything was just in chaos. The French government, those who had formed the French government were fleeing the country. The French called upon their old hero, Marshal Pétain, who ended up becoming the French commander-in-chief during the First World War, the one who brought the French army mutinies under control. The French armies had at a certain point decided in 1917, we are not fighting anymore. They decided to go on strike. Okay, nothing ever really changes. The French went on strike then, he will go on strike now. In that case, that was the case of, it was an instance of the entire French army going on strike, saying we're not fighting anymore. And Pétain was the one who brought things back under control. They were still done fighting, but he brought things back. He brought order back as the French commander-in-chief. But anyway, just another thing he did to set himself up as the hero to whom France in 1940, when everything was just crumbling to pieces, to whom they turned, and who set up a regime that was favorable to the church. There's no question of that, much more than the Third Republic had been, and brought back. It was something that today French conservatives look back upon wistfully. Is the time of the regime of Marshal Pétain. But as I mentioned it yesterday, it was not good. It's never good to be on the losing side of any major war or any conflict, much less a major war, least of all the biggest war ever fought. And that's exactly what Pétain ended up as. He was set up as the head of the Vichy regime, Vichy being a city in southern France, where his government ended up having its capital, and being seen as a collaborationist, falling under the label of collaborationist governments with Nazi Germany. He had precisely no other choice. In fact, he was in retirement, and he was called back out of retirement. All of the Third Republic politicians all ran away. They all escaped to Britain, and including de Gaulle himself, he ran away there. He gave radio broadcasts to the French resistance from London, very safe from the German army. So while he was doing that, Pétain was managing as best he could to rule what was left of him to rule of France under the shadow of Nazi Germany. It's true, the Germans did not occupy all of France. They occupied certain parts, but they didn't occupy all of it. Hitler himself certainly never had the ambition to rule France. Germany never had that idea. They never wanted to make France part of their empire. not officially. They perhaps would have been happy to have, as in fact they did under Pétain, a government that was cooperative with them, but was never the idea. Let's incorporate France into the Reich. They certainly never had that idea. That incorporating into either the Second or the Third Reich. So de Gaulle, though, coming back as the head of the Free French Forces, as they were known, wants to get rid completely of anything and anyone having to do with any government that had any cooperation at all with Nazi Germany. Just get rid of everybody. So get rid of so Pétain obviously has to go, and anybody who worked with Pétain, who worked with Nazi Germany, and that includes this particular nuncio. Pius XII refused to comply. His nuncios were appointed to states, not to particular governments or heads of state. Villeray, as Pius XII pointed out, was already nuncio to France at the time of the Popular Front in 1936. Villeray, had outlasted two very different regimes. He could cope with another. In this, here we see, again, the theme that the church will just work with whoever is there. Provided it's legitimate, the church will work with whoever's there. Even in the case of Soviet Russia, the church was willing to negotiate secretly, but willing to negotiate some kind of agreement. Even perhaps not one that would provide official recognition, but negotiate some kind of agreement, all for the good of souls. All for the good of souls. So the church generally will work with whoever happens to be there. We saw this a couple of years ago, or perhaps last year during the reign of Leo XIII, but when all of the nations in South America that we know today had all of their revolutions and threw off the imperial rule of Spain and Portugal, that the church went to those governments and sought to work out things with them, provide for the good of the church, for the good of souls in those countries. Of course, that's one and the same thing. And Spain and Portugal got upset about that, but at the same time, they didn't do anything to, or at least whatever they did, if they did anything at all, was insufficient to prevent those countries from becoming independent. So the church will work with whoever happens to be there. The church does not, unless, with rare exception, the church does not take sides in either wars, any kind of clashes of purely political clashes of interest. The church does not get involved in that. So yes, indeed, the church always operates with whoever is there. Remember, put very succinctly by Pius XI, everybody who has ever desired to see the church disappear has himself disappeared. Every pope has understood that, and so it's all different. There are different schools of thought, obviously, with how to deal with those people who will eventually disappear. But there's always that idea that they will eventually go away. They will be consigned to the pages of history, and the church will still be there. The papacy will still be here to the end of time, of course. So the church can afford to bide its time. Time is always, in other words, on the side of the church. Always. Certainly in the long run. Time is always on the side of the church. These arguments on the part of Pius XII as to why his nuncio should remain were, of course, correct, but de Gaulle, as we said, wanted to purge ruthlessly from the new and better France, as he saw it, that was emerging from anything that smacked of collaboration with the Nazis. Anything at all. So, August 1944 was a decisive month, militarily and politically. Yes. Question?
Germans occupying Paris up to this time?
Yes. Oh, yes. They controlled it. It became something of a resort for high-level German officers. All these generals who started staying in Paris. Everybody always wants to go to Paris, even if you just conquered it, and you're the German army in 1940. You still want to go to Paris and have a good time. All right. So yes, until August of 1944 that the Germans controlled Paris. So this was August 1944 was a decisive month militarily and politically. On August 20th, German troops broke into Pétain's bedroom at the Hôtel du Parc in Vichy and shipped him off to Germany. Villeray and the Swiss ambassador were on hand to record the old man's last indignant protest. It was actually very sad what happened to Pétain after the war. He was condemned to death for having collaborated with Nazi Germany. He wasn't actually executed because of his age and the fact that he was a French national hero, but he was his reputation was not spared any more than anybody else's was. So his is easily the saddest story of everybody who was involved. The saddest, certainly at any rate, among the most prominent figures who collaborated to any degree at all with Nazi Germany. He definitely didn't like Nazi Germany, but obviously he had little to no choice in the matter. The French military capacity was destroyed right at the outset. I mentioned the Schlieffen plan that the Germans had in the First World War, which was to invade France through Belgium. And in 1940, the French and the British thought the Germans were going to do the same thing again, but they didn't. But the Germans knew, so the British and French thought that the Germans, were going to do the same thing. So knowing that, the Germans let them rush into Belgium, but then cut behind them from the south. They came up from the south through the Ardennes forests, a region nobody thought they could get through. It was considered impassable in 1914. Everybody thought it would be impassable again in 1940, but it wasn't. But somehow the Germans managed to bring their tanks through paths that were considered footpaths and impassable to any kind of heavy military equipment. But they managed to get through, got behind the British and French forces, and won a total victory. The Battle of France. It's just known as that, the Battle of France, because it was just one big fight, and the Germans won it all. Which was unfortunate for Germany in the long run, actually, because it gave Hitler an enormous boost of confidence in his own judgment. All of his generals had told him, it's a terrible idea, let's not invade France like that. But he followed his gut and did it anyway, and it turned out to be a huge success. So after that, he consistently disregarded the advice of his generals, which resulted in his making all kinds of just absolutely idiotic strategic decisions that ended up costing Germany that war. So, in a way, that was a very bad thing for Germany on that title. But in the short term, it was a total victory, almost total. The only thing they didn't win completely was the fact that the British Expeditionary Force famously got away at the Dunkirk evacuation. But other than that, it was a total victory for them. So the point being that Pétain had nothing with which to resist Germany. I mean, they'd come to terms with them, actually. So there was no longer a state of war between the Vichy regime, which was the French government at that point, and Nazi Germany. So there was nothing he could do legally, really morally, or even with regard to pure material capacity to resist Germany. So in August, therefore, the Germans decided to take him to Germany, get him out of a place where he could easily be taken by Allied forces, and get him to a place that's safe. And he didn't want that. And Valéry and the Swiss ambassador were there to record his last indignant protest, which was just a courtesy that it would have been indecent to refuse, but it made de Gaulle still more determined to remove the nuncio. Paris was liberated in August after a messy insurrection and very little destruction. So it's true that the war caused some European cities to be absolutely devastated, demolished, just obliterated. In fact, for one thing, on both sides, there was the city of Coventry in England was destroyed. In fact, the Germans even came up with a new verb to describe it. I don't know the exact pronunciation of the German word, but the English equivalent is Coventryize something. That means if you make a Coventry out of something, is to absolutely just obliterate it. That's what they meant by Coventryizing something. So one of the things that was destroyed in their bombing of Coventry was the Coventry Cathedral, which had been made a cathedral by Benedict XV. You can tell even from the shell that remains of it that it wasn't a very nice church at its time. It was really more of a large parish church before it was elevated to the status of being, in effect, a small cathedral. It was destroyed during the war and the old one was not rebuilt. Instead, they built an unimaginably hideous thing right next to it. It was so hideous, if you were to put prisoners in it, you'd say that's inhumane. You wouldn't use it as a stable. You'd say that's inhumane. It's just absolutely horrendous. But when you go to a city like that, you can practically see where the bombs fell. Some older buildings on either side of the road are over there and over there, but right here, buildings that are clearly newer, you can practically see the path of the bombs. So that's Coventry, for example. Of course, London was bombed heavily. But on the other side, the city of Dresden in Germany was bombed heavily. In fact, they had it all figured out. There was one layer of bombs that would be dropped to knock out all the windows and all the buildings, and then a second layer of bombs that would set all the buildings on fire. And in fact, there's a book about it called Firestorm, about the destruction of Dresden during the war. And that fires were so intense, sucking in huge amounts of oxygen, because fire needs to breathe, obviously, sucking in huge amounts of air, causing winds so strong that people were pulled into burning buildings as a result of the strength of the winds. So, that was all deliberate. That's known as strategic bombing. Dresden was not a target of any particular military significance, but all of that bombing, both what is known as the Blitz, bombing of large-scale bombing of Britain, the large-scale bombing of Germany, or of Japan for that matter, prior, at least that's before we're not even talking about the atomic bombs here, but all of that known as strategic bombing, rather than targeting a specific military target, which is tactical bombing, strategic bombing has as its target, broadly speaking, the morale of the people, the nation's people. The idea being we will bomb them so hard that they will lose all will to fight. They'll just beg for peace because we'll bomb them so hard. Historically, it never works, though. It always has the opposite effect. The British, certainly, their resolve was stiffened by being bombed, and the same thing was true of the German people. Their resolve was just stiffened by all that bombing, which was actually worse than what had been inflicted in Britain. Though the British were actually the first to bomb Germany. The British bombs fell on Berlin before any German bombs fell on London. The Blitz was actually undertaken as a retaliation for the British bombing of Berlin early in the war. So, all of that to illustrate that some cities were absolutely destroyed, demolished, just leveled to the ground. Others, well, such as Berlin itself, but not I'd say every last thing in it, but generally speaking, Berlin was destroyed. But other cities were spared. Paris was largely spared almost entirely. There was little to no destruction of anything in Paris. The city of Prague also actually was intact at the end of the war. Within the region of, or within what was Czechoslovakia. We saw happen to that early on. But some cities were destroyed. Paris was not. The Free French Forces, as they were known, were granted the honor of being the first into the city. While all that's going on, away in Istanbul, formerly known as Constantinople, the former capital of the Turkish Empire, which was the capital, by the way, of Turkey, was moved to where it is now, Ankara, that's the common pronunciation of the name of the city now, was moved there after the fall of the Turkish Empire. That was another empire that was dismantled at the end of the First World War. The capital had been called Constantinople up until then. After that was switched to the Turkish pronunciation Istanbul, which you can see they still have the stand there, and the B and L correspond to the P and L of Constantinople. That's a botched Turkish attempt to pronounce Constantinople. Istanbul, but the pronunciation was officially changed to that, and the label was officially changed, and the capital moved to a different city. It's all part of a way of this secularized, westernized, to an extent, Turkish Republic separating itself from its militant Islamist past on the part of, you might know the name of the first president of the Turkish Republic who did all of that. Who actually, we'll see, certain things he did have to do with Roncalli's career. Anybody know the name of that first president of the Turkish Republic? Yes. Yes, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He was the one who, to a great extent, secularized Turkey, making it to the Turkish Republic that we know today. So, all that's going on in France, which is really the center of attention. The war was very widespread, and there were many fronts. There were many battles going on in different places. For example, there was the whole Pacific theater, the United States fighting Japan in the Pacific. There was still fighting going on in Italy at the time. Rome itself was another city that was spared, but there was still fighting in Italy. The Germans have controlled Rome for a while. At a certain point, they just pulled out of it. Just left to the British and Americans who were fighting their way up Italy. But there was fighting going on there. The original idea being, first, there was the famous fighting in North Africa. The idea was get that under control, then invade Sicily, then invade Italy, and get into Germany from the south by going up Italy. Contrary to Napoleon's advice that if you invade Italy, you have to go into it like a boot from the north. They decided to go in from the south, and they should have heeded Napoleon's advice because it didn't work. Eventually, there were still battle lines were maintained there, but after a while, all that took second place to the invasion of Normandy in 1944. And that ultimately, at the end of the war, there was an Italian puppet state over which Mussolini ruled for a while in the northern part of Italy. They never got into Germany from the south that way. It was faster. It turned out to be faster to invade Normandy, go all the way across France, liberate Paris, go through Belgium and the Netherlands, and get into Germany that way. That ended up being faster than going north through Italy. And anybody have any notion as to whose idea it was to invade Italy that way, to get to Germany ultimately in that fashion? Winston Churchill. He's another idiotic strategic thinker. He was responsible for a catastrophe during the First World War. Anybody know which that one was? The Gallipoli landings, very famously. His idea in that case was to land in the Dardanelles Straits, which was that was all Turkish controlled. Get the map off the wall. Too much effort at the moment. It's not that important for us right now. But his idea was to attack the Turks, to knock the Turks out of the war, and by that means throw Germany off balance and defeat Germany by defeating first its Turkish ally. It didn't work. It was a catastrophe. But that was actually where Mustafa Kemal Ataturk first himself became a Turkish national hero. The Turks were Germany's allies in both wars were nothing but a drag, and the Turks fought much better when they were under German officers. One exception to that being Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who, in fact, he had to be pretty much everywhere all the time in order for the Turkish troops to fight well. To the point that he was going for a long time without sleep, being followed around by a doctor who was administering stimulants to him constantly, so that he could keep going for as long as the fight lasted. But all of that, just indicating different cities, some of which were just ravaged, others destroyed, others of which were spared, either completely or almost completely. Paris being one of those. There was no fighting in Turkey in the Second World War, but that's where Giuseppe Roncalli was, in Istanbul, celebrating the feast of St. Louis IX, King of France, not realizing that it was the decisive day in the liberation of Paris, and that for the first time in 4 years, the, in fact, revolutionary tricolor fluttered from the Eiffel Tower. In fact, recently, Macron, current French president, made the blue on the French flag, he turned it to a darker blue, which was closer to the original revolutionary hue. It was changed at some point subsequent to the revolution, and he recently changed it back, which is interesting to note. He also at one point said, this was years ago when Trump was in office, but Macron said that he was talking about, he was probably addressing Trump, but he said that he said that nationalism is opposed to true patriotism. Macron said that. Nationalism is opposed to true patriotism. That is just straight out of Lenin, because the idea being that you should be patriotic to this international conglomerate, to the worldwide, what Lenin wanted to see is the worldwide communist regime. And you should be patriotic to that, not to any one nation within that. So to be nationalistic is to be as opposed to true patriotism. And Trump's response to that was, why are the French saying this? There is no people more nationalistic than the French, and deservedly so, he said. So, for all of his problems, Trump got that right, certainly. Okay, so the next day, August 26th, 1944, de Gaulle led his forces down the Champs-Élysées and into the Cathedral of Notre Dame. But all was not quite well. Shots rattled around the nave. One looked in vain for Cardinal Emmanuel Célestin Suard, Archbishop of Paris. He was held prisoner in his own palace, suspected of collaboration. Like most French bishops, he had welcomed Pétain in the confusion and despair of defeat. The resistance movement had divided French Catholics. So the resistance movement was composed of leftists, and we'll see that here in a second. In fact, that's why I sent out some excerpts from the encyclical Notre Charge Apostolique by St. Pius X, who addressed the errors of the Sillon movement in France, which was, we saw it last year, but modernism is something that's difficult to nail down. That being said, St. Pius X himself nailed it down perfectly, exposed it, destroyed it in every possible way in his encyclical Pascendi in 1907. But one of the aspects of it was sociological modernism. There was a philosophical modernism, theological modernism, and also a sociological modernism. And the Sillon was very much a part of that. So then St. Pius X himself had to address it directly by name in this French encyclical as is published in French. So the French resistance was just full of all these leftists and communists. They were all very happy to see Soviet Russia emerge victorious from the war because they were of the same ideology. They were not just any socialists, they were of the international variety, at least in principle. So the resistance movement had divided French Catholics. Those of the school of Marcigny, a sociological modernist whose Sillon movement was condemned by St. Pius X, became ardent Gaullists. That's to say, they were in favor of Charles de Gaulle. So this is where we'll review this. It's very good to review some of these things, considering, as we'll see here, this was not dead. In modernism, we saw St. Pius X put it down, but we're going to have to go back to this to some extent because we're looking now at Roncalli. All this we're setting up now is painting the scene into which Roncalli would be inserted as the nuncio to Paris, the Holy See's nuncio to Paris. And all of this is actually from a biography very highly favorable to John the 23rd, highly favorable to Giuseppe Roncalli, written by, according to Father Ricosa's research, who wrote, Father Ricosa, you may know, wrote a whole series of articles on John the 23rd, which probably should be put together into a book, though he never quite finished it. He could finish it and put it into a book that would be very good for us, on John the 23rd, called The Pope of the Council. And one of the first things he mentions is that he wrote in the early 90s, shortly after the publication of this biography of John the 23rd, and he says that the author of this work was a Jesuit priest who, it seems, abandoned the priesthood, but still wrote a work favorable to John the 23rd. So it is highly favorable to him. It's, to a great extent, it's very good in many ways, in as much as it's very well researched, very well written. Contains a great deal of good information, but it's not to be recommended, certainly not, because it is definitely written by somebody in favor, fully in favor. I mean, not to say it's not I wouldn't go so far as to call it a work of propaganda against the faith, at least not blatantly so, but he says things that very definitely let you know that which side this particular author was on. So he presents the facts. All the facts are there. So if you know how to process the information correctly, you can get a great deal of good information from it. But that's why we cannot recommend the book. And these notes I'm taking are exactly that, notes from that book, or notes from Father Ricosa's articles in some cases, based on information from that book. Because the information is there. All the facts are there. And in fact, presented in a very well-written manner, but presented by somebody who definitely has chosen a side and makes it clear. And he's not blatant about it, but he definitely makes it clear. So, Sillon was exactly that, part of the sociological wing, we'll call it, aspect, part of the modernist movement. And so we'll look at some excerpts of Notre Charge Apostolique. Again, these are only excerpts, as lengthy and as dense as these quotations are. These are only sections of the encyclical. Reading the whole thing cannot be too highly recommended, But at this point, we'll look at least some of it early in the encyclical. Does everybody get the message containing this? Okay, good. So you could find the whole thing. You could find the whole text of it easily in English, but I'm just looking at some parts of it. You see that very first paragraph, St. Pius X, praises certain aspects of the movement, which is what popes typically do very first thing in an encyclical, if then whoever they're addressing is then going to be chastised later on. That's usually how it starts. Be nice at first, and from there lead into the criticisms and condemnations, in fact. So he says, for example, that not seldom during public debates, stung by a question or sarcasm, you saw them, members of this movement, jumping to their feet and proudly proclaiming their faith in the face of a hostile audience. So, this was the heyday of the Sion, he says. Its brighter side accounts for the encouragement and tokens of approval which the bishops in the Holy See gave liberally when this religious fervor was still obscuring the true nature of the Sillonist movement. The day came when perceptive observers could discern alarming trends within the Sion. The Sion was losing its way. But then he poses the question, could it be otherwise? Its leaders were young, full of enthusiasm and self-confidence. But they were not adequately equipped with historical knowledge, sound philosophy, and a solid theology to tackle without danger the difficult social problems in which their work and their inclinations were involving them. They were not sufficiently equipped to be on their guard against the penetration of liberal and Protestant concepts on doctrine and obedience. In the first place, we must take up sharply the pretension of the Sion to escape the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical authority. Indeed, the leaders of the Sion claim that they are working in a field which is not that of the Church. They claim that they are pursuing aims in the temporal order only, and not those of the spiritual order. That's the Sillonist, as to say, the member of the Sion personifying all members of it. The Sillonist is simply a Catholic devoted to the betterment of the working class and to democratic endeavors by drawing from the practice of his faith the energy for his selfless efforts. They claim that neither more nor less than a Catholic craftsman, farmer, economist, or politician, the Sillonist is subject to common standards of behavior, yet without being bound in a special manner by the authority of the Church. So this is first problem. He gets into the peculiar errors of the Sion, that is to say, errors which characterize it, not errors exclusive to it, but errors which characterize it later on. To apply to these fallacies is only too easy. It should be T-O-O. It's only too easy. For whom will they make believe that the Catholic Sionists, the priests and seminarians enrolled in their ranks, have in sight their social work, only the temporal interests of the working class? The truth is that the Sionist leaders are self-confessed and irrepressible idealists. They claim to regenerate the working class by first elevating the conscience of man. They have a social doctrine, and they have religious and philosophical principles for the reconstruction of society upon new foundations. They have a particular conception of human dignity, freedom, justice, and brotherhood. And in an attempt to justify their social dreams, they put forward the gospel, but interpreted in their own way. And what is even more serious, they call to witness Christ, but a diminished and distorted Christ. Further, they teach these ideas in their study groups and inculcate them upon their friends, and they also introduce them into their working procedures. Therefore, they are really professors of social, civic, and religious morals. And whatever modifications they may introduce in the organization of the Sillonist movement, we have the right to say that the aims of the Sion, its character and its action, belong to the field of morals, which is the proper domain of the Church. In view of all this, the Sionists are deceiving themselves when they believe that they are working in a field that lies outside the limits of church authority and of its doctrinal and directive power. That would be one thing if they were simply a group of Catholics who happen to be involved in politics and are pursuing political policies that serve the interests of the church. That would be one thing. But here they're taking upon themselves to teach the theory of all this, all these things we're talking about here, social, civic, and religious morals. And that definitely falls under the domain of the church. They cannot claim, we're just a political activist movement. The church has nothing to say about our activities. So even if, he gets to this later, but even that would be problematic in itself. So even as he says right here, even if their doctrines were free from errors, it would still be a very serious breach of Catholic discipline to decline obstinately the direction of those who have received from heaven the mission to guide individuals and communities along the straight path of truth and goodness. So even if their assertions were true, which they're not, even if they were true, it's still problematic. But, as we have already said, the evil lies far deeper. The Sion, carried away by an ill-conceived love for the weak, has fallen into error. So they teach things that are positively erroneous. It's not just a matter of failing to be sufficiently submissive to the directives of the church. It's a question of having fallen positively into error in the theory which they inculcate, very definitely inculcate in their people. Indeed, the Sion proposes to raise up and re-educate the working class. But in this respect, the principles of Catholic doctrine have been defined, and the history of Christian civilization bears witness to their beneficent fruitfulness. And here he refers to Leo XIII when he says, "Our predecessor of happy memory reaffirmed them in masterly documents, and all Catholics dealing with social questions have the duty to study them and to keep them in mind." He taught, among other things, that Christian democracy must preserve the diversity of classes, which is assuredly the attribute of a soundly constituted state, and it must seek to give human society the form and character which God, its author, has imparted to it. So yes, a nation can choose its form of government to an extent, up to a point. Once its government has been constituted, they're not free to embark on revolution and overthrow the government. But they are, when a nation is being constituted, they are allowed to choose which form of government they want. But certain things cannot be gotten rid of. For there will always be, in other words, a hierarchy in society, always. Even in, say, communist nations, say in communist China or communist Russia. Even in places where theoretically everybody was perfectly equal, the fact of the matter is that there were different levels in society. That cannot be escaped. In fact, the Soviets would even say that. They even admitted that effectively by saying, well, yes, everybody's equal, but some are more equal than others. Whatever that's supposed to mean. Whatever their explanation for that makes no sense. In fact, everybody is on a different level of society. Everybody is located within one or another tier, so to speak, just within the state. So that's always the case, even in this country also. In the United States, that is also true. There is very definitely a type of aristocracy that we have here. It has, although unfortunately, has all of the worst aspects of every aristocracy without any of the good aspects of any aristocracy ever to have existed in the history of the world. Unfortunately. But that is most definitely the